Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in as we get into one of my favorite units that we work on for our poetry class here, working with what's called found poetry. It's sort of hard to explain since it's often more of a visual thing, but there's a fairly good lengthy description of it in the unit itself, so I'll let you discover that on your own. But one of the things that is so fun about this unit, or at least this type of poetry, is that it involves some of the things that are really the most interesting about being an active reader and writer, whether you're a poet or other kind of writer or really another kind of artist in general. But it's this kind of activity that we have for seeing, in the case of found poetry, you're seeing existing language in a different way. You're trying to re-see it, or in some cases reconfigure it so that it works in ways that are different than how it's supposed to be working. So it's sort of playful and a little, countercultural at the same time. And the best examples of found poetry are those in which the text as it exists prior to you finding it, you can manipulate or reconfigure in certain ways. And again, the examples are easier to understand for this. Such that the meaning you dislocate into this text is almost counter to the meaning that it had been trying to communicate beforehand, especially when language is used to communicate just all of the mundane stuff around us about directions for doing this or why not to do this, rules and regulations and all this kind of stuff. Very staid language and sort of boring and stuff like that. In this exercise of found poetry, we don't end up writing our own language to do something different, to be interesting and engaging and imaginative and all that kind of stuff. The idea is to really find those impulses and reveal them in language that already exists out there, where it's obviously not trying to be all of those poetic things that we do try to make language do when we write our own poems. So again, the examples are fun to look at here within the unit itself, and they'll hopefully give you some ideas. And so the fun thing about this unit then is really that you can spend the better part of the week, honestly, and the work for the unit is every day, all the time, paying attention to all of the language that exists around us in, again, like just looking around my office, there's titles of books, there's forms that I'm looking at, there's just like stuff written everywhere. It's almost so much that we just block it out because otherwise it's too much. But what's really kind of fun is to begin to really pay attention to that language and to see if there's ways of making it work, or of hearing it or seeing it, or reconfiguring it in certain ways to make it a lot more interesting than what it is already trying to be. And there's lots of examples of how found poetry can work. Like I say in the unit, it really is helpful to look through a number of those examples so you have some ideas of how you can be playing with language to produce found poetry. But ideally, you really let this kind of unfold over the next few days so that you don't just sort of pick the first example you can find. And there's nothing to say that you couldn't, even though the unit just asks you for the one example, to post a number in the discussion board. If you keep finding ones that are, funnier and even more strange than the last ones, by all means, post more than just the one. But do, again, sort of give yourself time to find examples and let that sort of way of seeing language really unfold over a few days, rather than just trying to get the assignment done as quickly as possible and find the first example that you can find. So hopefully the examples of found poetry in the unit are useful, and the description of kind of what found poetry is and how it's supposed to work in the ideal situation, and really why it's valuable as poetry, since it obviously can strike some people as kind of like cheating. You're not even writing your own stuff, but in many ways it takes more creative or imaginative work to work with existing text and to see it and make it poetic, where it's sort of not trying to be. In some cases, a lot of text that we run into is trying to be anything but poetic. It's trying to be direct, to the point, eliminate all possible meanings, but just this one very singular one. And that's what it wants to do, but language really doesn't work that way. So it's fun to expose the myth of, simple meanings by showing how language can mean lots of different things, even if it doesn't really want to. And like I said, the best and sometimes funniest examples of found poetry is when language can be made to work in sort of the opposite way, or to communicate the opposite meaning of what clearly it had been intended to do. So hopefully you can have some fun with this unit, and people will discover some really great examples of found poetry. And it's obviously most interesting and kind of most amusing when the examples come from those really surprising places. So give yourself a few days to be attuned to language in terms of how it's operating, how you can find it and make it work in ways that it doesn't necessarily want to. This is sort of like the poet's revenge in some ways. We often feel the prisoner of language, are always at the mercy of words and how they operate. But in this unit, or for this sort of exercise, we can make language work for us instead of always feeling like we're at its mercy. Okay, so hopefully you have some fun with it. Be in touch if you have any questions.